My family raised me to marry my cousin, at 18, to preserve our bloodline. Then I escaped, testified, and watched the FBI raid our house. My parents told me I'd marry my cousin Adrian Voss the day after graduation at 18, to preserve our superior bloodline through planned breeding. My mother, Margaret Voss, came from a wealthy Southern family that lived like the Civil War never ended, and believed they had leadership DNA. Father, geneticist Dr. Heinrich Voss, was fired from 3 colleges for his racial views, but continued his research in our basement lab. They collected family DNA and made breeding charts for our dining room walls when I was young. It was calculated that Adrian and I have the most founding stock genetics. Adrian was 30 and had trained me since I was 13 for cousin bonding. He'd drive me and tell me how glad he was to have me as his breeding partner, and how many children we'd have. 5 minimum, he'd say while massaging my shoulder. Maybe 7 if your hips grew properly. My parents accepted these sessions and left us alone in the house for hours despite my discomfort. Mom dressed me up and told me to be sweet to my future husband before he arrived. They sent the dates to other genetic reservation families after choosing our family's historic property for the wedding. They prepared me for breeding at 18. Mom took me to reproductive system specialist Dr. Anton Kruger for childbearing approval. The doctor was no longer licensed, but my parents believed him because he shared their views on racial purity and genetic supremacy. The doctor gave my parents fertility tablets and a breeding calendar with my most fertile days. Adrian began visiting frequently and discussing our future children's genetics at family dinners. He stated, "Our firstborn will have the perfect Nordic features," as my parents grinned. "Selective breeding will revive this family." I tried telling teachers, but my parents believed I was mentally disturbed and lied for attention. Because they provided so much to the school, administrators didn't investigate. I begged my older brother Julian Voss for help, but he shrugged and said he married his second cousin 8 years before. Why the fuss? All the family did this dreadful thing and treated me like a marketable cow. Mom homeschooled my senior year to control me and prevent outside influence. She made me read genetic superiority books and quiz me on 11-generation bloodlines. I contemplated impossible escapes out my bedroom window for hours, suffering from loneliness. While searching for escape money, I uncovered my grandma Beatrice Voss's diary in the attic, changing my life. She documented decades of forced marriages and rejected females, corrected, preventing them from having children. A weird accident killed another cousin who loved someone outside the permissible genetic pool 3 weeks before her forced wedding. Names, dates, and photographs of wounded girls who resisted were in the diary. While helping others escape, my granny was caught and electroshocked until she lost their identities. Last entry cautioned ladies who found this. They will kill you before infecting lineage. Each page revealed more horror about my family's breeding scheme and wicked past. I reached one of the escaping cousins, Ingrid Voss, using a diary code and learned of an underground network that helped our family girls. She thought 9 years of masking her identity were worth being observed. Adrian's next visit, as my parents were preparing for the wedding, she took me up. The simple method, which needed precise timing, took days to memorize. They found the diary and escape plan. Adrian arrived that day with others. Medical equipment and his 2 relatives froze my blood. Dad stated the wedding was moved to tonight because I was unstable. Mum locked the doors. Dad removed leather handcuffs from a medical bag and said, "We'll do the ceremony first." Adrian smiled at me as he prepared a syringe for an IV drip. "Don't worry, cousin," he whispered. "The sedatives will make you more cooperative for breeding." 4 males blocked every exit as I backed against the wall. Mom held me when Adrian inserted the needle. He said, "Just a little prick. And then you'll be mine forever." I kneeled on Adrian's groin before my thoughts could catch up. He dropped the syringe and collapsed, moaning, as I escaped Mom and grabbed the diary. Dad charged me, but I dodged his arms and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Mom shouted for my cousins to save me as Adrian groaned on the floor. As footsteps rose, I shut the upstairs bathroom door and wedged a chair under the latch. Dad ordered someone to get his garage tools as their weight rocked the door. My palms shook as I typed Elena Weiss's emergency number with our agreed-upon message on my phone. My practice run split the bathroom window, so I pushed it wide. I squeezed through the window frame and while Dad worked on the door hinges, dropped onto the garage roof after climbing the toilet and sink counter. Despite injuring my ankle, I leaped off the garden shed roof. The bathroom door broke above me, and Adrian shouted that I was in the garden. After years of solo exploration, I ran toward the tree line, knowing every path and hiding location. I followed the creek track into the dark woods because I knew it. Elena said she'd be at the old bridge in 6 minutes on my phone as flashlight lights cut through the darkness behind me. I knew this was my only opportunity, but each step tortured my. I have 3 aunts who tried to run away but were caught, and, twisted ankle. Seeing the bridge without a car was alarming. Dad's truck's headlights appeared after branches cracked, not Elena's gray Honda. As he slowly drove past, lighting the trees, I held my breath behind the concrete bridge support. Adrian was directing the search pattern on his CB radio and telling someone to investigate the gas station down the road. I froze for another minute until spotting headlights from the other direction after the vehicle passed. Elena's gray Honda pulled up, and I hurried from my hiding place, leaping in through the back door. Before I secured the door, she gasped and we passed Dad's truck returning to the bridge. As our automobiles passed within feet, I lay flat in the back seat, frightened to breathe. Elena drove steadily for 10 minutes before letting me sit up. When we stopped at a truck stop 3 hours later, I shut myself in a toilet stall to read Grandmother Beatrice's diary again. Although the safehouse sheets were moist, I read 4 states' addresses. Elena gently knocked, suggesting we relocate, and I recalled I left my phone in her car. Despite my ankle swelling in my shoe and severe leg discomfort, I followed her back to the Honda. As the mountains disappeared, she drove into the darkness discussing network rules. She said, "No contact with anyone from our past for 6 months minimum while they build a legal case. The safe residence will contain fresh IDs and a similar case lawyer. They knew how to hide us and have helped many girls escape households like mine." As the familiar countryside faded, I realized I would never return. Elena called while I ate scrambled eggs at a diner 3 states away the next morning. TV over the counter aired local news without mentioning a missing girl. I wondered if my family phoned the police or handled things internally, as Grandmother's diary suggested. Elena answered network calls outside because her phone rang often. She returned with a tense look and stated they were starting emergency protocols. My family had police ties in other states, and the network caught roadblock discussion. Changing cars and taking a safer route was important. Why preserve so many records if the family is wrong? Their atrocities are chronicled in the grandmother's journals, wall breeding charts and DNA samples. The network was busy protecting 4 other girls who escaped similar situations this year. Elena paid the bill, and we found a blue car with the keys under the carpet in the parking lot. Elena claimed 6 years of freedom as a survivor. Woman who left it left. We left the Honda for someone to pick up after relocating my luggage and diary to the new car. As we drove away, I imagined those other females fleeing Adrian and their families' breeding programs. Rich families with perverse beliefs coerced young girls into genetic reservation schemes more often than anyone wanted to admit, creating the network. Elena took girls from religious compounds and privileged houses like mine. We ran from breeders. 2 hours later, Elena stopped at a rest stop, and a state trooper's cruiser near the entrance made me sick. Police officers stood beside their cars, using their phones and watching passing cars. Elena saw him too and flinched, but she drove leisurely toward the parking slots. Stopping far from the trooper, she wrote swiftly on her phone with her head down. We departed walking normally despite my weak legs when she stated, "Bathroom." Elena grabbed my arm and held me as the trooper approached Elena's car. In the women's room, she led me beyond the stalls to a maintenance-only door she opened without stopping. Elena pushed me toward a minivan key-holding woman while glancing at the front door. Greta Lindholm started the van as we sprinted across the back lot. Greta drove slowly as Elena stared behind us, relaxing after 10 minutes. Greta left her family 22 years ago when they tried to make her marry her uncle. She said her parents reported Elena as a cult member who kidnapped females. The news dubbed me a brainwashed victim, and my parents sobbed over their daughter on every channel. These families often presented escapees as insane, so no one believed us. I was in a little apartment 4 days later trying to recall my new name, Clara Moreau. The network's lawyer, who wouldn't reveal her name, gave me a stack of paper and told me to write everything. She advised me to jot down the breeding program details while they were fresh in my mind. I kept writing about Adrian, supplements, and doctor appointments after 20 pages, even though my fingers cramped. The lawyer handed me my missing news on her laptop. Mom wiped her eyes and Dad cried for my homecoming, recorded perfectly by the camera. They sympathized and branded me selfish and ungrateful for leaving wonderful parents. Nobody wondered why an 18-year-old would flee nice parents on TV. A critic said I was probably on drugs, and another said, "Kids today don't appreciate good families." The lawyer said this was usual for families like mine that controlled the story. Mom was hospitalized from stress, Julian claimed over the burner phone. He begged me to call to let them know I was alive since Mom might not. Elena grabbed the phone as I went for it and listened to Julian. He changed tone and said they could find me with or without help when I didn't respond. We packed within an hour after Elena hung up since a burner may track the call. Greta took us to another safe home and told me her story in simple terms. Her relatives pressured her to procreate with her mother's brother at 15 to maintain their bloodline. Her 32-year-old daughter continued the tradition after she fled after giving birth. Numerous accounts of girls and women who escaped and failed were broadcast. 1 week after my escape, I was at my fourth safe place, unable to sleep since every sound made me jump. To remember why I ran, I checked the locks and read Grandmother Beatrice's diary. Isabel Voss returned for a basement wedding after 3 years in hiding. Her family sedated her for the wedding, and she had twins 9 months later before leaving. I wondered if Isabel was dead or locked in a family property with babies. The network doctor found a tiny ankle scar after I mentioned the vitamin shots. I don't remember surgery, but she said it looked surgical. The X-ray showed metal under the skin. The doctor went white when she discovered it was a tracking chip put during one of my checks. After removing it immediately, she noticed 2 chips nestled like Russian dolls. The first sent my location, but the second was inactive until she removed it. The monitor received a louder signal after a loud buzzer. The doctor predicted 30 minutes till help arrived, and the network went into emergency mode. I became cold seeing Dad's pickup at an intersection while Elena drove quickly to safety. 2 family were in the back, watching cars at the red light with Adrian in the passenger seat. Elena hit a parking structure and the tires screamed as we climbed the hill. We ran toward the stairwell, echoing off the concrete walls, after she stopped. Elena slowed me down as we hurried from the stairwell to the main floor to escape suspicion. The bus terminal was 3 streets away, yet every person we passed made my heart accelerate. Elena peered behind us as I pulled my hood up and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. Mom called from a corner payphone while I waited for Dad's pickup. We sped toward the Greyhound sign after she hung up. I stayed close to Elena while she bought my ticket with cash at the crowded terminal with suitcases. My driver's license had my photo but a different name and birthday, making me 21. Gate 12's departure indicator showed my bus leaving in 10 minutes. Elena walked me to the gate, then stared. "Remember the codes I taught you," she continued. She grabbed my shoulder and ran to the parking lot. I spotted Elena enter a different car via the window while waiting behind an elderly woman with heavy luggage. The bus driver took my ticket without looking at me, and I sat in the back to watch everyone. I watched Elena's car travel north while my bus headed south, pressing my cheek against the cold pane. As more passengers boarded, I lowered my hood to look for familiar faces. My knapsack held Grandmother Beatrice's diary on my leg after the bus left. I was alone for the first time since that basement night 10 days into my escape. The highway loomed ahead, so I opened the journal to a marked page. I felt uneasy reading Isabel's description in Grandmother's shaky hand. After escaping in 1989, she worked at an Oregon cafe for 3 years before her brothers found her. Grandmother heard cellar moans for 3 weeks after pulling her back. Grandmother found bloody sheets on the fire pile when Isabel never returned. Grandmother's comment that Isabel was caught pregnant by a non-bloodline ended the entry. I closed the diary and watched the miles, vowing not to become Isabel. My following bus at the Tennessee transfer station took 4 hours. I sat in a corner to monitor both entrances because the station was smaller than expected. I froze when my cousin Leon Voss questioned drivers near the ticket booth an hour in. He probably exhibited my photo and took their answers. My burner phone from Elena was in my hand when I silently entered the lavatory and sealed myself in. I mumbled when the network contact answered the second ring. I was told to buy a ticket the other direction, make 2 stops, and return tomorrow on a different route. After 20 minutes, I left without complaint. Leon remained at the ticket booth but faced away from departure gates. I bought a Memphis ticket and boarded as Leon approached my gate. I watched him inspect the other bus's passengers through the window as my bus left. 4 days later, I reached the next safe home, a modest ranch with an American flag. Talk about unwelcome family reunions. I was tracked like a lost pet instead than a woman who refused to marry her cousin. The responding elderly couple wore matching sweaters and smiled like wonderful grandparents. The wife served me tea while the father informed me they escaped breeding programs 45 years previously. I learned over pot roast that my family was part of a 14-state genetic purity network of thousands. The woman showed me her arm scars from her family trying to breed her with her uncle at 15. They retired to save girls like us and saved 14. Driven to court the next morning to file an emergency protective order. As I recounted the forced marriage and breeding program, the judge nodded politely. His face changed when I presented the family names. Shuffling papers, he said there was no immediate threat. In his argument of the order, I saw Judge Alaric Fontaine, one of grandmother's related families from her journals. He knew who I was and what I fled. I felt confined inside the safe house despite their goodwill. The old couple insisted I was safe 2 weeks after my escape. Yet it seemed wrong. I wanted water at 2 a.m. and heard kitchen voices. The phone man's voice made me creep down the passage and squeeze against the wall. "Yes, we have Clara," he muttered. "The real one. No runaways with that name. We'll gently bring her in tomorrow after she trusts us." My blood froze, and I quietly went to my chamber. They were bounty hunters returning runaways, not network members. I grabbed my diary and backpack, opened the window, and left in pajamas, sprinting toward the street without looking back. Flashlights illuminated the yard as the rear door opened behind me. I ran harder as porch lights came on, hitting the pavement. I heard dogs barking and car doors banging at the home and saw an unlocked car in a driveway. I threw open the door and dove into the back seat, covering myself with a forgotten jacket. The elderly couple and 3 men searched yards and garages with flashlights through the window. After they gave up after 2 hours of searching, I hid until daylight, because my feet were bleeding and I had no shoes. I escaped and walked to a library opening. The librarian barely noticed me as I headed to the rear computers. After entering Elena's codes on the network's emergency portal, I looked up the elderly couple's names and saw their images on the interceptor list. They caught runaways for 15 years as helpful grandparents, so they assumed I was caught after 3 days off the real network. Later, I read more of Grandmother Beatrice's diary about the decades-old false network in a study room. Some girls came home, but others disappeared. Families sponsored both real and fake escapes to catch runners. No one knew who was real anymore. Despite my family's gifts, Ms. Annalisa Hartman, my sophomore year counselor, was worried about me. She once asked whether everything was okay at home, but I was too scared to tell her. I dialed with a shaking palm and her recognizable voice answered on the 3rd ring. "My God, is that you, Clara? Your classmates think you joined a cult. Your parents say you fled with a religious group." I exhaled carefully and told her everything. The sentences were fast, and I could hear her breathing alter. After a minute of silence, she said she was coming for me. I started to tell her it was hazardous, but she hung up with a car engine starting before the connection went dead. I barely recognized her with her black hair and new clothes when she arrived in a beat-up Honda at daybreak. After 2 hours, I noticed the black SUV always stayed 3 cars behind us in any lane. My heart raced for 3 weeks in that motel room while she drove 10 hours to her new teaching job. She looked in the mirror and turned her steering wheel knuckles white, but she calmly told me she'd been following my family since she saw bruises on my arms last year. She took photos and stored my essays about family life. Adrian's face appeared in the glass as Ms. Hartman took the exit toward the police station without signaling. Adrian followed us into the parking lot and got out of his car before we stopped. Inside the station, he played his worried cousin and told the desk sergeant I was mentally ill, and Ms. Hartman was a predator grooming me online. He showed the desk sergeant a folder with 4 doctors' reports of persecution complex and false memory from childhood trauma. Inspector Diana Moretti examined the documents while Adrian said my parents wanted their sick daughter back for psychiatric care. Moretti noticed that the dates didn't match, and 2 of the signatures seemed identical despite being from different doctors. Adrian's cheerful face dropped when she said she needed to question us individually in separate rooms. My hands shook so much I couldn't hold the diary as I showed Moretti each page. She paled when she read about Officer Carl Reinhardt, who returned my cousin Clara Voss 3 times before she disappeared. Moretti put down the diary and called Carl to ask about 5-year-old payment records and typical families. She shouted before hanging up and told me her ex-partner had admitted to taking bribes to repatriate fugitive girls. She started an official investigation and told Adrian he wasn't transporting me while she notified state authorities about trafficking. Moretti had 2 cops take Adrian away while she secured protective custody. The women's refuge had bars on the windows and a security officer who checked everyone in, but I couldn't sleep the first night. I clutched the journal closer with every hallway stride and read my grandmother's final entry. Trust no one. Always have an exit. Moretti returned the next morning with federal agent Elise Dubois, a cult deprogramming and human trafficking expert. Dubois had seen similar breeding operations in other states, but my grandmother's diary was more detailed. She photographed and submitted every page as proof, revealing how medical specialists and law enforcement controlled these networks across state lines. Dubois put me with a verified foster family while they blamed my parents. No one supervised me, had me memorize bloodlines, or measured my hips for breeding. Madame Keller showed me a bedroom with actual windows and internal locks. I was enrolled under a protective identity and tried to focus on derivatives in calculus class, while the girl next to me whined about her parents not letting her go to a party. My family's breeding calendar predicted I would be pregnant with my cousin's child by now, but she didn't know. Luca Meyer asked if I wanted to go to homecoming because he thought my life was normal. One afternoon, Julian stood across the street from school, watching me walk to the bus. My security detail approached him, but he held a cardboard sign. Despite everything they'd done, I doubted her fate, so he knew how to make me doubt everything. Agent Dubois brought recordings from my parents' phones from the investigation warrant to the foster home that night. Dad was talking about retrieving their breeding stock, me, and Adrian was explaining the basement protocol for forced insemination. Ms. Hartman dyed her hair black and changed her style to help me. How did she know to conceal herself before picking me up? 3 days later, Dubois called me at the foster home to report the FBI raid results, which included sedatives, leather restraints, and breeding calendars for 12 girls in their network in my parents' basement. 3 pregnant teenagers said they were there freely, but Dubois saw Stockholm Syndrome in all of them. When they discovered how many families were involved in this breeding enterprise, the investigation expanded beyond my situation. I watched the news in the Kellers' living room as my parents protested religious persecution outside the courts. Mom lamented government overreach destroying European families, while Dad told reporters they were targeted for their traditional views. These senators supported them on TV, calling it an attack on religious freedom and parental rights. I realized how powerful this network was when protesters outside the courts held signs supporting family rights and traditional marriage. 7 weeks after my escape, Mrs. Keller taught me how to cook normal dinners without genetic optimization rules. As we made spaghetti, I explained how every meal at home had exact protein ratios and fertility-boosting vitamins to boost offspring production. Like Mom, she listened without judgment and gave seconds without calculating calories or asking about my reproductive health. Elena informed me through Dubois that she was preparing a case with 20 other network escapees to testify together. 2 girls recanted due to family pressure, and another fled last week. Generations of wealth and legal ties gave the network's lawyers infinite power. My deposition was next month after the Kellers' garage was spray-painted liar and all the front windows were damaged. A note in the mailbox threatened worse if I testified against my family and their sacred customs. I couldn't let the Kellers suffer for wanting to foster me, so I begged Dubois for another placement. I met Sophie Lindholm, who had fled 6 years earlier and was hiding in a guarded location with other witnesses. Sophie showed me abdominal scars from her corrective treatment after rejecting her arranged marriage at 16. They tried to remove her ovaries to prevent bloodline contamination, but she escaped mid-surgery while bleeding. 2 months after my escape, I had insomnia and obsessively checked facility locks at night. I refused the therapist's anxiety medication because I remembered my parents' fertility-disrupting supplements. I read Grandmother Beatrice's diary often, finding comfort in knowing someone else had survived and helped others escape. Adrian was released from attempted kidnapping and conspiracy charges within hours using religious freedom monies. He appeared on TV in a clean suit and claimed to be freeing me from indoctrinated sex traffickers. A supervised Keller's phone call made peculiar clicking sounds. According to financial data Dubois found, the breeding network placed judges, police chiefs, doctors, and politicians in many states. The FBI found my calls were traced despite security safeguards, indicating law enforcement was informing families. I had 2 hours to collect my few items and say goodbye to Sophie. 3 weeks later, Dubois drove me to the federal courthouse in a bulletproof SUV with 2 other agents. Metal detectors at every entry and guards checking ID twice made the building look like a concrete fortress. Dubois took me through the basement parking garage and up a special elevator, telling me Adrian would watch in the gallery. When we entered the courtroom and saw him in the 3rd row, wearing his nicest suit and staring at me, my hands started shaking. Adrian watched me as the prosecutor took me to the witness stand to swear on a Bible to confess. Adrian shook his head when I told them about the sedatives he brought to make me cooperate. I described genetic computations and ideal mating schedules on our dining room walls to the grand jury, who took notes. My voice trembled when I mentioned finding Grandmother Beatrice's diary and my aborted escape plot when caught. After 3 hours of testimony, Dubois brought me back through the tunnels to avoid reporters. She said Julian was arrested that morning for trying to bribe a federal official with €600,000 for my location from an offshore account linked to dozens of genetic reservation families in 14 states. Federal authorities tracked every transaction and froze accounts while making hourly arrests. I shared my story with 3 other girls who had left similar families at the witness facility in the common area. Teresa Falk joked about making t-shirts that said, "I survived a breeding cult," making us laugh for the first time in months. After comparing medical exams and breeding patterns, we found our family used the same unlicensed doctors. Teresa fled to a homeless shelter when her family tried to breed her with her uncle when she was 16. Another girl showed us scars from her father branding her with a family crest to identify her as breeding property. We laughed at horrifying events while eating microwave popcorn late at night. 4 months after my escape, Mom cried on a conservative talk show while showing my infant photos and telling the host the government took her daughter. She wore her nicest church dress and held a tissue. The host criticized traditional families and religious freedom. Counter-protesters surrounded the witness facility with my school photo placards demanding my return to my family the next morning. Security deployed guards and cameras everywhere, but the crowd grew larger and angrier each day. Seeing freedom through bulletproof windows made the walls feel like another jail. Dubois arrived that afternoon with paperwork linking my family to 6 unusual deaths over 40 years. 3 names from grandmother Beatrice's notebook stood out, including a cousin who fell below the week before her escape. When examined together, the patterns were clear, with similar injuries and illogical timings. Dubois warned me that having the FBI exhume bodies for more autopsies could endanger my family. That night, a black car idling outside the facility ran for hours, and tinted windows obscured whoever was inside. Security said they couldn't do anything unless someone left or threatened, but we knew who. Sophie gently evacuated the emergency exit and into a waiting black SUV during a fire practice 2 days later. Security footage showed her glancing at the camera before entering, as if to suggest it was her choice. 2 days later, Sophie's family released a video of her sitting in her childhood bedroom, saying feminists brainwashed her. She repeated her lines about wanting to go home with hollow eyes, like they'd poisoned her. The prosecutor called an emergency meeting to warn me that Sophie's recantation could ruin our case. 3 more witnesses refused to testify or return FBI calls after family contact. Defense counsel claimed a government scheme to undermine religious families retaining their traditions. All news channels disputed whether we were victims or liars trying to harm our parents' reputations. 5 months after my escape, my parents uploaded my childhood medical records, including psychiatric evaluations, online. Adrian calling me a liar in court, while I explained his sedatives was odd for a righteous person. I wondered if he knew it was wrong but only cared about the family. The evaluations called me insane and prone to making up claims for attention, but they didn't identify the network doctors served. Within hours, #Clara is lying trended as people analyzed every word to prove I was crazy. Strangers sent FBI tip-line death threats, saying I deserved what my family planned. 2 weeks later, Ms. Hartman, my old teacher, testified, and I watched from behind the prosecutor's table as she pulled out a large folder of photos she'd taken since I was 14 and placed them over the evidence table, showing bruises on my arms from Mom grabbing me during breeding lectures and marks on my neck from Adrian's grasp. Her defense lawyer asked how she got these images and why she never reported anything to Child Services if she was afraid. Ms. Hartman said she had tried 3 times, but my parents always had evidence indicating I was clumsy and wounded myself. The lawyer also mentioned her 10-year-old DUI and said she took images of a student for other reasons. After court, I met with a trauma psychotherapist who worked with cult escapees. She said my constant door and window checking was normal for PTSD, and that she still jumped when someone knocked on her door 20 years after escaping her family's religious group. The next morning, Elena testified via video link from a location the FBI wouldn't disclose for her safety. The defense objected every 30 seconds to her evidence that she helped 20 girls escape over 6 years. Elena listed dates, places, and girls who'd run away, including 3 from Adrian's family. She showed recordings she'd made for years of network members discussing breeding programs on her phone. The prosecution played Elena's recordings in court, and Adrian's voice was clear. What would happen when they got me back? When Dad discussed failing breeding stock and what happened to women who couldn't have children, the courtroom quieted. 2 jurors cried as they left after the judge requested a recess. 3 days later, the judge needed federal security to continue the trial due to death threats. 2 jurors requested an excuse, saying they were worried about their families after dead animals were dumped on their doorsteps. The defense requested a mistrial, saying media publicity prevented a fair trial. I watched everything I fought for crumble as the judge reviewed their motion. 5 months after my escape, I took online programs to finish high school while 2 FBI officers monitored surveillance cameras in the living room, and I did math homework at the kitchen table. Writing a constitutional essay was uncomfortable because I realized my family had perverted freedom to mean they could do whatever they wanted to their daughters. Julian contacted the prosecutor one morning to negotiate. He and his lawyer described breeding schemes in 45 states with shared genetic match databases for 6 hours. Some families swapped daughters like baseball cards for the best genetics. His statement showed that hundreds more families were doing the same thing as my family. After Julian told them about 3 corrective sessions she directly observed on resisting girls, Mom was arrested on conspiracy charges the next day. She was freed on home arrest with an ankle monitor, but her court photos showed her with unkempt hair and crumpled designer clothes. Elena called me crying about Sophie, a network girl, being discovered dead in her apartment while I was doing schoolwork. Elena knew Sophie would testify about her family's breeding operation next week, but the police ruled it suicide. We both knew the place might have been ours. Adrian wasn't supposed to contact me, but I woke up to messages from a fake social media account with photos of me at the foster home, walking into the courthouse, and doing homework in the safe house kitchen. The FBI went crazy trying to figure out how he got these images while I was under constant protection. They found a tracking device in my backpack and suspected my family was following me. I moved between safe houses every few weeks for 6 months while the FBI investigated who was leaking my location to the family network. After Agent Victor Hahn was found sending information to his wife, a German breeding family member, everything had to be transferred again. Running, packing, and never being safe exhausted me, but stopping meant they'd find me and haul me back. Or worse, Julian called me from a strange number the morning they moved me to the 5th safe house, to tell me Dad was found dead in his cell, hanging from a bedsheet, despite being on suicide watch, with a shaky voice. Dad had agreed to testify about the network's leadership for a reduced sentence, but he died within 12 hours. The guards claimed suicide, but the timing was too perfect, so the investigation split between murder and suicide. I and Julian had to tell the jury that the defense was poisoning, as the prosecutors tried to preserve their case without Dad's testimony. The defense lawyers hired experts on false memory syndrome and mass hysteria to explain how siblings could create shared delusions to explain family trauma. After a long day of testimony that portrayed me as a mentally ill child seeking attention, Dubois found me crying in the courthouse washroom. She sat on the dusty floor with me and revealed she'd been pulled from the case after her family was threatened, but Mom testified in a black dress and pearls the next week, blotting her eyes with a tissue as she told the jury I'd always been problematic and they'd tried everything to help me. She provided medical records from doctors I'd never seen, therapy notes from sessions I never attended, and medicines I never took. Her portrayal of a widow and mother who lost her husband to suicide and her daughter to mental illness was the jury deliberated for 3 days while demonstrators called me a brave survivor, or a liar on the courthouse steps. Despite not eating or sleeping, I read Grandmother Beatrice's diary in my hotel room, finding strength in the stories of women who had faced the same battle. On the second day, a juror was sent images of her kids at her house with a note about keeping silent. 2 days later, Julian called me from the hospital with his jaw wired shut after 3 men jumped him in protective custody and battered him until his spleen exploded. He refused to recant his statement, despite evident terror in every syllable. I visited him the next morning and held his hand as machines beeped around us, reminding him why we were fighting and that backing down meant they'd won. Later that day, I sat in a courthouse restroom cubicle listening to 2 women at the basins discuss our case like a performance. One said I was lying for attention because no real family would do such horrific things, while the other said her daughter made up stories when she didn't get. They laughed about wild teens as they left, and I realized how ridiculous our truth seemed to regular people who hadn't seen what families do behind closed doors. That afternoon, the foreman read in a trembling voice that Adrian was found guilty of attempted kidnapping, but not conspiracy. We presented boxes of evidence, but Mom was acquitted and the breeding network accusations were rejected for insufficient proof. The room swirled as the judge thanked the jurors and sentenced Adrian to 6 years, likely out in 3 with good behavior. Julian being jumped in protective custody with a burst spleen but refusing to back down showed the family's obstinate courage in the right way. Mom smiled at me from across the courtroom as her lawyer rubbed her shoulder and Adrian's lawyer discussed appeals. Dubois grabbed me outside the courthouse and put a flash disk in my hand before leaving without saying anything. I found every FBI document about the breeding network that night, including family emails about pairing relatives for best genetics. Le Monde contacted me 3 days later to clarify details from leaked documents. I knew Dubois had distributed copies to multiple news outlets. 3 more females who escaped years earlier called reporters with stories of forced cousin marriages and breeding calendars, keeping my phone ringing. 2 days later, Mom announced a religious persecution case against the government at a courthouse press conference in her nicest suit and pearl necklace. She said the payment will assist other traditional families defend their constitutional rights to arrange marriages. 4 teenage cousins I recognized from family gatherings stood behind her, and my stomach fell knowing they were next in line for breeding assignments. That afternoon, a 60 Minutes reporter asked me for an exclusive interview about my escape and the network. Dubois warned me that going public would make me a target, but concealing hadn't worked. I accepted and spent the next week gathering proof, including grandmother Beatrice's diaries and Mom's breeding records. 8 months after my escape, Ms. Hartman delivered my high school transcripts in a manila envelope to my apartment. She convinced the school board to award my diploma based on completed homework, despite everything. I cried on my couch holding that paper because I had done something they never wanted for their breeding stock. The next week, 60 Minutes crews turned my living room into a studio with lights and cameras. I displayed the breeding charts and my unlicensed doctor's reproductive system exam results on the coffee table. When I opened grandmother Beatrice's notebook to the sections about females who refused breeding missions, the interviewer paled. After the Sunday night interview with 15 million viewers, my phone flooded with notifications. Some called me brave, while others threatened my life and accused me of betraying my ancestors. 3 congresswomen launched breeding network investigations the next morning, and everyone wanted to talk about cousin weddings. Mom said on a conservative news program that I was mentally ill and taught by liberal professors to hate my ancestry. After seeing the interview, more survivors contacted me, including a 14-year-old girl partnered with her uncle. Elena cried because 4 girls had contacted her after hearing my story and made plans to flee. We spent hours on the phone planning safe houses and creating phony identities for females whose families would find them. 3 weeks later, the prison called to inform me another convict had stabbed Adrian in the shower and killed him. Adrian was recruiting white supremacists for the breeding network, so knowing one fewer predator may attack females like me was liberating. After the interview, the FBI raided 14 network families and removed 14 children, including a 14-year-old whose parents chose her husband. I watched the news from my flat and saw the same horror in those kids' faces as the night I ran. The prosecution had enough evidence this time to arrest Mom for conspiracy to abuse children and trafficking them for reproduction. After hearing about the network's witness disappearances, the court denied bail. Mom in her orange jumpsuit at the arraignment, not the immaculate matriarch who had run my life. Other network families turned on each other to get lower sentences, and the sick system collapsed. The prosecutor called to say 17 more people, including Dr. Kruger and many family patriarchs, had been arrested. Julian, my older brother, was arrested for transporting minor cousins to breeding meetings across state lines. As more survivors revealed similar breeding operations, the probe expanded to other countries. Within 8 months, most of the generations-old network's leaders were arrested. Julian was placed in witness protection by the marshals and relocated to Northern Europe with a name I didn't know, after testifying against the family in the ongoing trials. A month later, the prosecutor wrote me a letter apologizing for everything, for being too weak to protect me when he knew. He wrote that he was in therapy to figure out why he chose comfort above right. After weeks in my desk drawer, I could read the letter without shivering or forgiving him. I kept it. 8 months later, Congress made compelled genetic matching and breeding operations federal felonies with prison terms. I was astonished to see my name in the news with Capitol building photographs as Clara's Law. Lobbying damaged it, but it still protected other youngsters. My professional objectives led me to major in social work in the fall of college. I tried not to cry when reporters asked how it felt to change history while standing with 12 other survivors when the president signed it. My roommate heard my story from the news but never made me feel unique or upset. We studied and criticized teachers like normal students. Nightmares and jumping when someone touched me were common, but my therapist said it was normal after everything. After a 9-month trial, the jury convicted Mom on all charges in 3 hours. She said she was defending our family's legacy until they handcuffed her after the judge sentenced her to 27 years. She stared at me one last time as the bailiffs led her away, but I watched my phone. She wasn't my mother anymore, and hadn't been for Elena and I founded a legal group to help kids flee our homes, using what we learned underground. We had lawyers, safe houses, and FBI-free protocols. Grandmother Beatrice's journal network became real with business cards, funds, and a website. In twice-weekly therapy in a green office with comfy seats, I learned about PTSD and trauma responses. I still checked every lock 3 times, sat with my back to walls at restaurants and scared men when they got too close. My therapist reminded me that healing was not linear and some days were harder than others. She was right, Some mornings I couldn't get up and others I felt normal. One night, a young relative I'd never met called my emergency phone and said her parents were preparing her marriage to a 30-year-old. I activated our network and helped Elena call her state's authorities. 3 days later, she was secure in foster care and her parents were investigated. Rescues stopped the cycle again. I had never visited Grandmother Beatrice's grave before that spring. I carried fresh flowers and the diary that saved my life and many others. I sat on the lawn and told her about the network collapse, the new rules, and all the females who were free because she had written everything down. I finger traced her name on the granite gravestone and praised her for revealing the truth even when it was hazardous. The victim support group met every Thursday in a church basement to share stories. I told fresh escapees with the same haunted face that it gets better, not flawless or simple, but better. Always saying, "You're free now, and that's everything that matters." They cried, and I held their hands and remembered being 18 and afraid I'd never escape. Mom still thinks she's preserving their heritage after 27 years. How does the brain interpret breeding plans as protection? My roommate brought me coffee and joked about our statistics professor looking like a perplexed owl while I studied for a social work exam in my dorm room at 20. Students outside my window went to class without reading charts, genetic preservation meetings, or forced marriages. I was 20, single, childless, and free to choose my own future, exactly what my family never wanted. The diary was on my bookshelf with my textbooks, reminding me of my roots and why I would fight for every female still used as breeding material. I answered another emergency call from a cousin in Germany immediately. This was my life, decision, and purpose that nobody could take away.